Here we are in the first of two video presentations for Module 3. This video will review and summarize the key principles for effective assessment that are discussed in Chapter 2 of Brown. There are key questions that we need to ask as we evaluate tests which we may use in our classrooms, and also as we approach the design or adaptation of tests that we want to use to inform our instruction. The first is, what's the purpose of this test? What is it that we want to find out, and how are we going to use the results of this test? Secondly, what is it that we want to measure of our students' learning? What are the objectives? Thirdly, how will the test be designed and structured to reflect both the purpose and the objectives? This we call the test specifications, and in the specific module that I had created for you to give you the directions for your test analysis project, there will be more detailed instructions and guidelines about how to create the specifications of a test that is already in existence or that you are going to create. The fourth question: how will the test tasks be selected and the items arranged so that it is an effective test? And finally, how are you going to grade the test, and how will these test results be communicated to your students so that they are of use to them? As you know, there are a lot of tests that we administer to our students over which we have very little control over the form and format. Nevertheless, it is a worthwhile exercise to think critically about these assessments in terms of the questions on the previous slide. We often hear it said that form follows function, and this is also true of assessments. The design and structure of an effective assessment must address the purposes of the assessment and the objectives, the performance objectives that it is expected to measure. With that in mind, we should always be evaluating the tests that we use in our school settings. Even if we cannot adapt them or recreate them, we can be better advocates for our students by thinking critically in a more informed way about these assessments. These are just a few subcategories of the tests that we come across quite often. Of course, we've got aptitude tests such as the SAT or other entrance exams. We use two general types of proficiency tests in the state of Delaware: the Smarter Balanced Academic Proficiency and, of course, the Access Language Proficiency Assessment. And these, the key about proficiency tests is they're not directly linked to any particular course of instruction. They are a general assessment of mastery. Then, of course, we have already reviewed the WIDA screeners and models. These are types of placement tests. What other types of placement or grouping tests do you use in your classroom? Think about those. Do they effectively as the design of those tests effectively serve the purpose of placement? And then, of course, the younger students often use the DIBELS assessment. It's a type of diagnostic assessment that is often used to identify phonics strengths and weaknesses as they prepare to develop reading skills. Having said that, the main focus of the major projects of this course will be curricular tests, achievement tests. These are the ones that we in theory have the most control over, either as teachers in our own classrooms or as teams designing or adapting tests for a district or a grade level. So these tests are specifically connected to a curricular unit of instruction. They could be formative or summative, depending on when they are administered during the cycle of instruction. And for the state of Delaware, they are aligned as closely as possible to the academic content objectives of the unit, as well as the Common Core objectives. So with a view to evaluating this type of assessment, let's dig deeper into those 5 critical questions. First, what is the purpose of the test? So why are you creating this test? Okay. What is the significance relative to your instruction? How important is this test compared to other measures of student performance that you will be using? And what will be the impact on you and your students before and after this assessment? Second, what are the objectives of the test? So what are you trying to find out or measure? Obviously, we all have content objectives for most of our academic units or skills-related objectives. These are generally related to the Common Core. But we are now becoming more and more aware that we need to be more overt and explicit about the language objectives that are associated with that content. What is the language knowledge and language skills that your students must have in order to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of that content? And this is a separate set of standards that many of you may be familiar with now, but we will explore further in Module 5, the English Language Development Standards from WIDA. This is just a preview of what you will see in Module 5 about English Language Development Standards. As I said, we need to be thinking about being more transparent in our instruction of language that serves the purpose of demonstrating knowledge and skills. There will be resources available to you to look further into the development standards and how we use them. You already are familiar with the can-do statements, which are very similar to the standards. And what we will do in Module 5 is learn how to create objectives for our instruction and therefore for our assessments that incorporate not only content but also language and differentiated supports. Thirdly, how will the components of your test and the form and format of those components reflect both the purpose and the objectives? A key guideline that addresses this issue is that the structure and format of the test should follow the structure and format of your instruction. For example, if a unit of your instruction was delivered primarily through verbal and oral modes, such as discussion or verbal responses from your students, would it be appropriate to administer a written test or a reading test of that content if there had not been any learning experiences where the students had been asked to write? This is one of the reasons why we must be clear about the language objectives and make sure that our test specifications match those language objectives as well as the content objectives. Continuing on, we also need to make sure that our objectives are fully and accurately measured. Does the test task types fully assess the objectives that you are trying to measure? Are each of those task components appropriately weighted? And do they follow a logical sequence? These questions are the ones that we need to keep in mind as we evaluate assessments for these 5 key principles: practicality, reliability, validity, authenticity, and washback. So, what makes a test practical? I think one of the key considerations that our districts and states consider is expense. But we also need to think about how much time we have to administer a test. And then how easy is it to administer? And then how easy is it to score and grade? These are questions that rephrase those issues in terms of a checklist. Are the administrative directions clear and clearly established prior to administering the test? Do you know how long the test is going to take? And is the cost of the test within the budget limits of you as a teacher or of your district's limitations? The next one, reliability. This has to do with the degree to which an assessment tool produces stable and consistent results. So what this means is, will the same student get the same results on 2 different occasions? When we talk about reliability, there are several different focuses that we can consider. The first is student-related reliability. This has to do with the consistency of the student, him or herself. And these are some factors that can affect student reliability, right? Fatigue, having a bad day, anxiety. And then one to consider is test wiseness. What does that mean? This generally means that students have become very savvy about the structure and format of a test to where they might be able to determine the answer to a question without necessarily knowing the content. This is something we really need to pay attention to when we design or when we critically evaluate a test. Another type of reliability is what we call rater reliability. In other words, the consistency of how teachers or test administrators score assessments. The first is inter-rater reliability. This is about consistency of scoring between teachers. In other words, if you have 2 teachers scoring the same test, will they come up with the same or very similar score? Some of the factors that might affect that would be inattention or vague scoring directions, or perhaps lack of experience with the scoring procedures. The other type of rater reliability is intra-rater reliability. And this has to do with the consistency of scoring across time by one teacher or one grader. This is often an issue when we are grading writing assessments that take a long time, and we may be fresh at the beginning of our grading session, but may be fatigued by the end, and this could potentially affect our evaluation. And then, of course, another thing to consider is inadvertent bias against or for good and bad students before we even begin to assess their products. A third one is test administration reliability. Okay, this has to do with the conditions under which a test is being administered, the environment, the classroom. Is it noisy? Is it too hot? Have there been a lot of interruptions? These can all impact the reliability of the results of a test. And then, of course, there is the question of the reliability of the test itself. Some factors might be, is the test too long? By the time the student gets to the end of the test, you may not get reliable responses. I think we see this often in the annual assessments, where the assessments are very long and the students get tired. And then, of course, the quality of the test directions. Are there ambiguous items? Are the directions unclear? Okay, so the main idea about reliability is, are the results consistent? Now let's move to the principle of validity. And essentially, validity asks us to question, does the test evaluate what we think it evaluates? So to the extent to which reference is made from assessment results are appropriate, meaningful, and useful in terms of the purpose of the assessment. And there are several areas to consider when we think about validity, and many of them are very closely related to each other and are often conflated. The first three particularly, content-related validity, criterion-related validity, construct-related validity, these three are very, very closely related to each other. And then there is something called consequential validity and face validity. So let's talk about content validity. So one of the questions is, does the test include test items or test tasks that are relevant to the domains of the instruction? Does the test measure what we have taught? Is there a sufficient sampling of the subject matter and skills? So is the test broad enough so that you are confident that what you have taught has been adequately measured? And the second consideration has to do a lot more with how the test is designed. Does the test require the student to perform the actual behavior that is being measured? Okay, and this is particularly relevant with language production or language skills. Is the test measuring the actual skill, or is it measuring some other sampling of something by which we then assume by the success of that test that the student has mastery of that skill? And this is when we begin to discuss the validity of direct assessments versus indirect testing. So once we have reviewed the considerations about the content of a test, then we need to consider the criterion. Does the test measure the course objectives to the level of performance that we want to see from our students? Is the test accurately measuring the performance against the stated criteria? One way to do that is to compare the measures of one test to the results of another test which has been demonstrated to be valid as to its criterion. So one example of criterion validity is our driving test when we first go to get our driver's license. Normally we get into a car with an evaluator who evaluates our performance as we are actually driving to determine whether or not we are good enough drivers to receive our license. This is an example of a direct assessment. The actual performance is what is being evaluated, and that performance has a direct correlation with the skill that we are assessing. Now consider a written driving test. Would a written driving test be a valid test to determine whether or not we are good drivers? The way to determine that, one way to determine it, would be to compare the scores student by student of the written test that that student takes and the actual hands-on driving test that that same student takes, to see if the scores are comparable. And if they are consistently comparable across a broad set of test takers, then you might be able to presume that the written test has a high level of criterion validity. So that is an example of criterion validity that is considered concurrent validity or empiric validity. The test results are supported by concurrent performance on another test. So we could also say the same thing about a high final exam score on a language course might presume to be correlating to actual proficiency in the language. Another type of criterion validity is predictive validity. In other words, the scores of a test tend to predict fairly accurately or not the success of that test taker in a future learning activity. These are our placement tests, our admission batteries, our entrance exams. Okay, so we've discussed content validity. We've talked about criterion validity, which has to do with correlating the test scores with the assumed level of performance of the test taker. And now we want to talk about construct validity. This has to do more with the design of the test itself and the theories and hypotheses that drive that design. So the question we want to ask is, what inferences can we make about a targeted skill on the basis of the test performance? So the concept of a construct is a premise, a theory or a model that attempts to explain any observed phenomena. So the construct of the test would be the theory or model that attempts to explain why the student performs the way he or she does on the test. An example that we could use to explain this further is the DIBELS assessment that we often use with our young students. DIBELS stands for Diagnostic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. And many of the components of this test do not actually ask the student to read words. Some of the tests are actually listening tests for letter sounds within words. But a very common test that is given to our first grade students is something that we call nonsense word fluency. And you can see by this image to the left, these are patterns, CVC patterns. But as you can see, they're not actually words. And the construct or premise of this assessment is that if a student can decode the letters and put them together to make what would appear to be a word, even though it has no meaning, that this student is then ready to begin to read. If you have any experience with this test, then you are aware of the discussions and dialogues that take place around the validity of a test like this, particularly if it is being given to English language learners. So the question would be, does the scoring of a test like this have any bearing on a student's readiness to read? Or might there be some other factors that might be equally as important? Generally, assessments like this have been researched and have theoretical bases that have research behind them, but we often need to question what was the research design and who were the test subjects. So we might want to ask, when these tests were initially designed, were they tested on ELL students, and did they have the same results? As you can imagine, construct validity is of major importance for large-scale assessments. So consequential validity is a slightly different concept from the first three. It has to do with impact. So the impact of a test, because of its intended or unintended consequences based on the test's interpretation or how the test is used to make decisions for students, for teachers, and for programs. This is especially of concern when there is some question about the accuracy or validity of high-stakes tests. And then, of course, the impact on what? How does it impact motivation? How does it impact the subsequent performance of these students? For example, a test that that identifies students into a certain group, such as ELLs or Spec Ed, how does that test impact that student's performance into the future? How does it impact independent learning, study habits, test preparation, and overall attitude towards school? These are all considerations beyond the actual test construction of how a test impacts the learning process. So a slightly different concept from consequential validity is face validity, and this has less to do with the test itself and more to do with how the test is perceived, not only by teachers, but by students. So it has to do with the degree to which a test looks right. It appears to measure what it claims to measure. This is often very subjective to test takers and test administrators. And it is important that students perceive the test to be valid. If they don't perceive the test to be a valid test, it's gonna impact their performance on that test. So for a test to have a positive face validity, it needs to be designed in a way that it is quote-unquote biased for best. In other words, this test will give the student every opportunity to produce the best possible results in a fair and equitable way. And part of that, part of what goes into that is the opportunities for review, preparation, and suggestions of strategies. So a face validity checklist might include a test that has the look of being well constructed with a format that is expected by students with tasks that are familiar to them, that's doable within an allotted amount of time, that has clear, uncomplicated test items, clear directions, tasks that relate to the coursework that they've been working on, and has a difficulty level that will present a reasonable challenge to them. Because as you can imagine, a test that's too easy is also going to have a negative impact on the face validity of that test. So another key principle is authenticity, and this has to do with how a test is correlated to the real world in meaningful ways. So some of the factors that ought to be considered in terms of authenticity is, does the test contain real world tasks, or at least approximate them? Is the language natural as possible? Are the items of the test contextualized, put into a situation rather than isolated and disassociated from each other? Are the topics meaningful and relevant to the students? And are you able to thematically organize the test items in a way that makes sense, either with a storyline or with a focus topic that organizes all of the test items in a meaningful way? A final principle is related a little bit to face validity, but has a different focus. It's called washback, and it has to do with how the students benefit from the feedback of a test. So post-assessment impact on a student's future learning and development, and also pre-assessment impact on how the student learns, how he prepares for the assessment, and how the teacher helps the students through the learning process to prepare for the test. So an example of that might be large-scale assessment, how the students may actually teach to the test. So that would be possibly a negative washback. Formative tests obviously provide washback to the learner in a purposeful way in order to make progress toward learning goals, and summative tests provide washback for learners to initiate decisions about future learning goals. So when classroom tests are purposely viewed as learning devices for the students, then you have the opportunity for beneficial washback. In a way that it positively influences how teachers teach and how students learn, and gives learners feedback that builds on learning and development. So it's a key factor in formative assessments, obviously. Provides conditions for peak student performance and enhances facilitation of language development as well. So, with the consideration of these 5 principles, we want to restate again that good tests follow research-based rules and ethical standards for the task selection, the task design and construction, and the scoring of the performance of the test. And of the 5 principles that we've discussed, we've talked about practicality, reliability, validity, authenticity, and washback. Of those 5, they all point in toward the importance and priority of validity. So let's reframe these principles into some of the guiding questions that you will ask as you evaluate and analyze your selected test. Is the test practical? Is it reliable? Can you ensure rater reliability in the scoring? Does the test truly measure what it proposes to measure? Is the test a complete measure of the content? Has the impact of the test been considered on the students and on the teachers? Is the procedure of the test biased for best performance? Are the test tasks as authentic as you can possibly make them? And does the test offer beneficial washback to the learner? So as you consider your selected test and apply these principles, particularly as it relates to your English language learners, I want you to keep this idea in the back of your mind. Academic language is a second language for all students.